some point in the last few years, a crow died in your neighborhood. Not one you knew, not one whose name you could have given, because crows do not have names in any human sense, but a crow that had a territory, a history, a set of relationships with other specific crows that had been building for years. A crow that was known. What happened next, in the hours and days after that death, is something almost no one has ever witnessed. Not because it is rare, because it happens at the edges of human attention, in the trees and on the rooftops, and along the wire lines of ordinary neighborhoods, in a language that most people walk past without registering as language at all. Crows hold funerals. That much has been documented. But what researchers found when they looked more carefully at what actually happens at those gatherings is something that the existing vocabulary of animal behavior is not equipped to name. Something that sits in the space between what we call instinct and what we call grief. And that forces a question about the boundary between those two things that science has not yet resolved. If this is your first time here, subscribe now. Every video goes deeper than the last. Stay until the end. Because the last thing we cover is the question that changes everything. Most people, when they think about what animals do when another animal dies, think about it in one of two ways. Either the animal moves on immediately, because animals do not have the cognitive or emotional architecture to register loss in any meaningful sense, or the animal grieves in a way that mirrors human grief closely enough to be recognizable and therefore comfortable. Neither of those frameworks survives contact with what crow research has actually found. What researchers discovered is something that does not fit either model. Crow behavior following the death of a known individual is neither immediate indifference nor a mirror of human mourning. It is something specific, structured, and consistent enough across individuals and populations to demand its own description. A description that the field of animal behavior has been working toward for decades without arriving at language precise enough to fully capture it. Mark Bekoff, professor emeritus at the University of Colorado Boulder, whose foundational work on animal emotions and cognitive ethology has shaped how the field thinks about non-human emotional experience, has noted that the crow response to death represents one of the most behaviorally complex and least adequately described phenomena in the study of corvid cognition. Tonight, we are going to try to describe it. The first thing researchers documented is the gathering itself. When a crow dies, other crows come, not immediately, not all at once, and not randomly. The arrival is staged. It begins with the crows nearest to the death site, the ones whose territories overlap most closely with the territory of the deceased. Then it expands. Crows from adjacent areas arrive over the following minutes. In documented cases involving well-established individuals with large social networks, the gathering can involve dozens of birds from territories that extend well beyond the immediate neighborhood of the death. Colleen Cassidy St. Clair, researcher at the University of Alberta, whose work on urban corvid ecology and behavioral responses to environmental events has produced some of the most detailed field documentation of crow gathering behavior available, found that the size and composition of these gatherings correlates directly with the social centrality of the crow that died. A crow with extensive social connections, one that participated actively in the information networks and alliance structures of the local population, draws a larger and more geographically diverse gathering than a crow that lived at the periphery of the social group. What this means is that the crows arriving at the gathering are not responding to the body as a generic stimulus. They are responding to the loss of a specific individual whose position in the social network they were aware of. The gathering reflects the deceased crow's social footprint. The crows stand near the body. They call. They do not forage. They do not display territorial behavior. They do not engage in the ordinary activities that fill every other minute of a crow's day. They are present in a way that has no other name in the behavioral literature than attendance. They showed up. They came. The second thing researchers documented is what the crows do with their voices. The calls produced at crow death gatherings are acoustically distinct from every other call type in the corvid repertoire. They are not alarm calls. They are not territorial displays. They are not the recruitment calls that bring other crows to a food source or a threat. They are not the contact calls that maintain communication between individuals moving through a territory. They are something that researchers, when they first began systematically recording and analyzing the vocalizations at these gatherings, found they could not place within the existing taxonomy of corvid calls. Barbara King, Professor Emerita at the College of William and Mary, whose research on grief and mourning across animal species has examined the behavioral and vocal signatures of loss in birds and mammals, found that the vocalizations produced at crow death gatherings share a consistent acoustic profile across different populations and geographic locations. They are lower in frequency than alarm calls. They are slower in tempo. They are produced with a regularity and a sustained quality that distinguishes them from the reactive, situationally triggered calls that dominate most of corvid vocal behavior. King has been careful about the language she uses to describe what these calls mean. What the data establishes is that these calls are not produced in any other context. They appear specifically and exclusively in the presence of a dead crow. They are consistent enough in their acoustic properties to be identified and categorized as a distinct call type. And they spread through the gathering in a way that suggests they carry social information in a form of shared vocal behavior that has no parallel in any other documented corvid context. The crows are saying something. Researchers are still learning what. Researchers did not expect to find this. When the gathering data and the vocal analysis began producing consistent results, the field had a working framework for understanding what was happening. The framework was functional. Crows gather around dead crows, the reasoning went, because dead crows carry information about threats. A dead crow in a location signals danger in that location. The gathering is a risk assessment. The calls are alarm signals. The behavior is adaptive in a straightforward evolutionary sense and requires no further explanation. That framework did not survive the next layer of data. Ursula Gebhardt, researcher at the Max Planck Institute, whose work on social bonds and long-term relationships in corvids has examined how individual crows maintain and express connection to specific other crows over time, found something in the death-gathering data that the threat assessment framework could not account for. The crows attending the gathering were not behaving like animals assessing a threat. They were behaving like animals responding to the loss of a specific individual. The evidence was behavioral. Crows that had established documented long-term social bonds with the deceased, bonds tracked over years of field observation, showed measurably more intense behavioral responses at the gathering than crows with weaker or no prior relationship to the individual. They stayed longer. They called more. They returned to the site in the days following the gathering at rates that exceeded what threat avoidance behavior would predict. They were not avoiding the location of danger. They were returning to the location of loss. Gebhardt's data also documented something that required even more careful handling. In several observed cases, crows closely bonded with a deceased individual showed behavioral changes in the days and weeks following the death that extended well beyond the gathering itself. Reduced foraging activity, altered movement patterns, changes in social interactions with other members of the group, changes that persisted on a timeline inconsistent with threat response, but consistent with something that, in any other species, would be described without hesitation as the behavioral aftermath of grief. Science does not yet have a word for what this is in a crow. And what comes next is what changes everything. The fourth thing researchers documented is the one that extended the timeline further than anyone initially expected. Crows avoid the location where a known individual died, not permanently, not universally, but in a pattern that is specific enough and sustained enough to rule out simple threat conditioning as the complete explanation. Colleen Cassidy St. Clair's field data on crow movement patterns following death events in established territories found that crows who attended a death gathering showed statistically significant reductions in their use of the specific location where the death occurred compared to their use of that location in the weeks before the death. The reduction persisted for periods ranging from several days to several weeks, depending on the individual crow and the nature of its relationship to the deceased. This is not the behavior of an animal that has learned to associate a location with a threat. Threat conditioning in corvids produces rapid, consistent avoidance that diminishes over time as the threat fails to reappear. What St. Clair documented was different. The avoidance was stronger in crows with closer prior relationships to the deceased. It was not correlated with the presence of ongoing threats. And it diminished not as the threat faded, but as something else shifted in the behavioral patterns of the individual crows involved. The location carried something for these crows that was not reducible to danger, something that the closest bonded individuals needed time and distance from before they could return to using it the way they had before. The fifth thing is the one that forced the most direct confrontation with the question the field had been carefully avoiding. Crows bring objects to the place where a crow died. Not food, not nesting material, not objects with any obvious survival utility. Small items, fragments, things that the depositing crow appears to have selected and carried deliberately to the death site and left there. Giorgio Valordigara, researcher at the University of Trento, whose work on comparative neuropsychology and the evolution of complex behavior has examined the cognitive requirements underlying object deposition in corvids, has noted that this behavior is among the most cognitively demanding and least understood in the entire corvid behavioral repertoire. It requires the crow to form a connection between a specific object, a specific location, and the fact of a specific individual's absence from that location. It requires holding all three of those things in mind simultaneously and acting on their relationship. That is not a simple cognitive operation. It is not reflex. It is not conditioning. It is something that, when humans do it, we call it leaving something at a grave. We call it remembrance. We call it the physical expression of the fact that someone was here and is no longer here, and that their absence has a weight that ordinary behavior is not equipped to carry. Science does not call it that when crows do it. Science does not yet have a name for what to call it. We need to stop describing the behavior for a moment. Because the four things we have covered, the gathering, the calls, the avoidance, the objects left behind, and the fifth thing that preceded this, all of it has been framed as documentation, as behavioral data, as the careful, qualified language of researchers who are trained to describe what they observe without claiming more than the evidence supports. But you are not a researcher. You have been listening with the part of you that already knows what grief looks like, because you have felt it. And that part knows something the careful language is working very hard not to say directly. It looks the same, not identical, not equivalent in every dimension, not confirmable as the same internal experience through any instrument currently available. But behaviorally, structurally, in the sequence and the duration and the specificity of who it affects most deeply, it looks like what happens when someone who mattered is gone and the world has to reorganize itself around the absence. Barbara King has written something that applies directly here. She noted that the question of whether animals grieve is less interesting and less useful than the question of what grief is. If grief is defined as the behavioral and physiological response to the loss of a significant social bond, then the evidence that corvids experience something that meets that definition is substantial. The argument is not over whether crows feel what you feel. It is over whether what you feel is as unique to you as you have always assumed. The crow at the gathering did not choose to be there. It simply went. The way you go when someone who mattered is gone and going is the only thing that makes sense. At the beginning of this video, I told you that what crows do when they lose someone sits in a space between instinct and grief that science has not yet resolved. and I told you that the last thing we covered would be the question that changes everything. Here it is. The reason science has no word for what crows do when they lose someone is not because the behavior is too simple to name. It is because the behavior is too close to something we already have a name for, and naming it that way would require us to accept an implication that the field has been moving towards slowly and with great care for a very long time. The implication is this: grief as a functional capacity did not begin with us. Colleen Cassidy St. Clair, Giorgio Villordigera, Barbara King, Mark Beckhoff, Ursula Gebhardt. Researchers across institutions and decades, what their collective work points toward, without any of them overstating what the data allows, is that the behavioral architecture underlying the crow's response to the loss of a known individual is not a pale imitation of human mourning. It is an independent expression of the same underlying capacity, built along a different evolutionary path, expressed through a different behavioral repertoire, but rooted in the same thing that roots human grief: the existence of bonds that matter, the fact that specific individuals are not interchangeable, the experience, if that word is permitted, of a world that is different because someone who was in it is gone. Science does not have a word for what crows do when they lose someone, because the word it would need is one we have always believed belonged only to us. I want to end with a question that has nothing to do with research. Have you ever watched a crow for long enough that something shifted in how you were seeing it? Not a dramatic moment, just a moment where it stopped being background and became something else, something present, something that was also, in some sense, watching back. If you have had that moment, I want to know about it. Describe it exactly as it happened in the comments below. What you were doing, what the crow was doing, what changed. Those descriptions tell me something about this community that nothing else can. I read all of them. See you next time.